of what our Constitution stands for. For example, before the Civil War, people knew that states had the right of what's called nullification. If the federal government produces a law that's not constitutional, states can nullify it. So, like, example, this health care bill. States can say, hey, we want no part of this, it's not constitutional.
Right, and that's what they're trying to do with the lawsuit.
But ever since,
federal government.
correct, and ever since the Civil War basically said, you know, after Abraham Lincoln's argument to get into the Civil War was that the Union was a solid contract, and there was no getting out of it unless it was an approved measure. That was never the part of it. The whole part was it was a voluntary union. It was states that they were actually like little countries that voluntarily got together under the Constitution, and they had the right to secede at any time. Jefferson, who was one of the greatest founders of the Constitution, stated this in his papers when he talked about nullification and secession. So when you go back to it, Abraham Lincoln is one of the first, in literal history, he was basically a constitutional tyrant. He overrode it, and people try to say, oh, well, it was for slavery or different things like that. No, it wasn't. When you look at the whole issue, it had little to do with slavery and had more to do with federal power. That argument has been going on a long time between the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians. The Jeffersonians had said, you know what, centralizing power, centralizing banking power is a problem. And it always leads to corruption, because in men, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
That's
and
right.
They knew this. But with the Hamiltonians, they were actually very sympathetic to the British Empire when we first started forming the independence and trying to get our independence movement going in the U.S. before the United States. And they said, you know what, we want a central bank, we want a central federal government, more power to it. That was the Hamiltonians. And throughout time, back then there was never the Republican or Democratic Party. There was no such thing back then. Over time, both of those were formed. And unfortunately, what we've seen over time is both of them have leaned more towards the Hamiltonian side of centralizing federal power in the federal government. The Republicans have paid lip service to the Jeffersonian side, saying, yeah, we want states to have state power and state rights. But realistically, they've done very little to safeguard that or to reverse the legislation that the progressives have pushed forward. Because what happens is, you get Republicans in office, and they'll go, okay, let's take a conservative step back. They take one step back. And then the progressives get in office, and they take 10 steps forward. Well, the conservatives get back in, and they chop down a bunch of legislation, take one step back. They're always being drugged along. And then eventually, for example, the Republican Party that's supposed to stand for its platform, which talks about constitutional directives, becomes just a party of power and not a party of principle.
So now, what party do you affiliate?
I've been a Republican since I was 18. I am running as a Republican, and I believe the Republican Party still has a chance at redemption if it will follow the constitutional mandates that it originally stood for. If it doesn't, then it doesn't deserve to exist, period. Because if you're a party for principle, then you run on the principles, and you don't have problems with other smaller parties. For example, you guys have heard of the Tea Parties?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Everybody does.
Yeah, they're the big thing now. They're vogue. They were actually started before Rick Santelli, but Rick Santelli made them very famous. They talk about the constitutional mandates and everything that needs to be done in government, reducing spending, lower taxes, fiscal conservatism, all of this. But when it comes down to it, if the Republican Party had followed that for a long time, there would not be the need for a Tea Party or another party to come out and say,
that's right.
What are you doing? Because when a party just goes for power, you'll see what happens in China. I was in China for a year and a half. They have a party there. It's called the Communist Party. They don't
How did they get so far off their base? How did the Republican Party get so far off their base?
There's a couple different reasons. One of the main ones has to do with certain think tanks that are in Washington, such as the Council on Foreign Relations is one of the biggest ones. And they always push an agenda that people wouldn't call progressive per se, but it's an agenda that erodes state sovereignty and eventually national sovereignty. And they're the ones that push certain issues that the Republicans and the Democrats pick up because they have the most enlightened speakers and the most intelligent thinkers that come there to speak. The Council on Foreign Relations was an import from Britain, and it was an attempt to try to get us.
So who's on this Council of
Well, in the last election, the last presidential election, every single member except for Ron Paul, from the Republican side and from the Democratic side, except for maybe Kucinich, I'm not sure about him, but these guys were all Council on Foreign Relations members. You can go to their website and you can actually look at different lists and you can find out whose members are with them.
Are they